Assalamualaikum everyone. So basically, we have reached to the last part of chapter 8, and in this chapter, we will be covering the structure of the heart, the flow of blood in the heart, the cardiac cycle, okay, and also the control of the heartbeat. Okay, okay. So let's look at some important features of the heart. So the size of the heart is about, roughly the size of your fist. Okay, and the average mass is around 300 gram. Okay, and it is made up of cardiac muscle. And if you look in your textbook, you'll see that cardiac muscles are made up of cardiac cells, which are interconnecting cells with cell surface membrane tightly joined together, right? There's a diagram on page 173 that shows how the cardiac cells is joined to one another uh, by uh, a structure known as intercalated disc. Okay, you can look at page 173, the diagram at the bottom of the page. Okay, and the purpose of having those cells interconnected is to allow nerve impulse to travel efficiently, right? Because in order for the heart muscle to contract, the impulse needs to travel efficiently from the atria to the ventricles. Okay, so I guess this is a familiar diagram to you. It's a three-dimensional diagram of the heart, and in your syllabus you are required to know all the blood vessels that are connected to the heart, right? So I guess you are familiar with the vena cava, pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, and also aorta. Okay, and if you look in this particular diagram, you can see that there are small blood vessels that runs through the wall of the heart itself, right? And these are what we call as coronary arteries. These are blood vessels that branch out from the aorta and goes to the heart itself, because heart is made up of living cells, and therefore they need oxygen as well. So there must be a blood vessels that goes into the heart to supply those important nutrients and oxygen. And that blood vessels are known as the coronary artery. Okay, and this is the cross section of the heart. So it gives you a better idea on how how blood flows into the heart and out of the heart. Okay, so I guess you must have already known by now that blood is returned to the heart through vena cava. So we have superior vena cava and we have inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava are vena cava that comes from the top part of the body, while inferior vena cava will be the blood vessels or the vein that comes from the bottom part of the body. So blood from vena cava will be poured down into the right atrium. Okay, and when atrium contract, blood will be pushed into the right ventricle through a valve known as tricuspid valve. Okay, and next, the right ventricle will contract. Blood will then be forced out of the right ventricle, okay, into the pulmonary artery, where blood will then be sent to the right side of the lung and to the left side of the lung. Okay, and you can see the two branches here. Okay, and from the lung, once the gaseous exchange has taken place, okay, oxygen has been replenished, so blood will then move back to the heart through pulmonary vein, and from pulmonary vein, it will go to the left atrium, and when atrium contract, blood will be pushed to the left ventricle through bicuspid valve, and whenever ventricle contract, whenever the left ventricle contract, blood will then be pushed out of the heart to the rest part of the body through aorta. Okay, so this is basically the direction of blood flow inside the heart. Okay, so I guess it's pretty much easy for you guys, since you guys have learned this again and again, okay? Especially in IGCSE. Okay, so next we are going to look at cardiac cycle. So what is cardiac cycle? So cardiac cycle is basically defined as the sequence of events that takes place in one heartbeat. In average, normal human being will have roughly about 70 heartbeat per minute. So it means that normal human being will have about 70 cardiac cycle per minute. And cardiac cycle will start off with the muscle contraction of the atrial walls, right? And this is known as the atrial systole. Okay, when you talk about the heart muscle, systole will always refer to the contraction of the heart. So the contraction of the atrial wall will force blood into both of the ventricle, the left ventricle and the right ventricle, through atrioventricular valve, right? The bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. Okay, and the function of both of these valves is to prevent blood from flowing back to the atrium, right? To the atria. Okay, so whenever ventricle contract, so blood will be prevented from going back into the atria. Okay, and if you look at the diagram, okay, the cross section of the heart, you will notice that there are two other valves that is located at the base of the pulmonary artery and at the base of the aorta, and this is known as the semilunar valve. And the function of semilunar valve is to prevent blood that has been squeezed out by the contraction of the ventricles, okay, from flowing back into the ventricles, right? So whenever ventricle contracts, blood will be pushed out to the pulmonary artery and to the aorta, okay, and because you have these two semilunar valves, okay, blood will not be able to go back into the ventricles. Okay, so the next phase in cardiac cycle will be the ventricular systole, right? So ventricular systole is also known as the ventricular contraction, and it takes place 0.1 second after the atrial systole. So basically, the duration of atrial systole is 0.1 second, and right after that, okay, ventricular systole will take place. So in ventricular systole, what happens is that the ventricle walls will contract and it will squeeze blood out of the heart. Okay, and as soon as pressure in the ventricles become higher than the atrium, okay, both bicuspid and tricuspid valves will shut, right? Because if the valve do not shut, then blood might go back into the atria. Okay, and the duration of ventricular systole is about 0.3 seconds. Okay, the next phase in the cardiac cycle, okay, which is the last phase, would be the ventricular diastole. So if systole stands for contraction, diastole stands for the relaxation of the heart. And during this particular phase, both of the ventricle and atrial muscle relaxes. Okay, uh, high pressure blood that has just been pushed out into pulmonary artery and aorta, okay, would flow back into the ventricle, right? So right after the contraction of the ventricles, okay, blood will be pushed out, okay, to the pulmonary artery and the aorta, correct? But whenever ventricle relaxes, the gravity will pull blood back to the ventricle. Okay, but like I said just now, blood will not be able to return back to the ventricle because of the presence of the two semilunar valves that is located at the base of the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Okay. Okay, so figure 8.26 that we have here basically sums up what we have discussed just now in terms of cardiac cycle, right? The three major phases in cardiac cycle, okay, like what we have discussed just now, are the atrial systole, okay, and it is shown here in the first picture, where you can see that the volume of the of both of the atria is smaller compared to the other two pictures, right? So the smaller volume of atria shows that the wall of atria is actually contracting, and you can see the two arrows pointing towards the two ventricles, meaning that blood is being pushed to the right and the left ventricles. Okay, so this is the first phase in cardiac cycle, the atrial systole. Okay, and then 0.1 second after that, okay, in the second picture, you can see that ventricular systole starts to take place, and the difference in diagram is noticeable. Okay, you can see that the volume of ventricle is much smaller compared to the first picture, and this shows that the wall of ventricle is contracting, pushing the blood out of the heart into the aorta and also pulmonary artery. Okay, so this is the ventricular systole, and finally we have the last phase of the cardiac cycle, which is the ventricular diastole. Okay, and again, if you compare, okay, the volume of the atria and the ventricles, you will see that the size of the four chambers are much bigger compared, okay, to the second picture. Okay, and this shows that both walls, atria and ventricles, are in the relaxed phase. Okay, so figure 8.27 shows how the heart valve function. So we know that there are four main valves inside the heart, right? Valves between the atria and the ventricles are known as the atrioventricular valves. And we have two types of the atrioventricular valves, which are the bicuspid and the tricuspid. Basically, bi means two and tri means three. And cuspid means cusp, right? Cusp. Or in other words, we can also say, we can also call it as flaps, right? So bicuspid means valve with two flaps, while tricuspid means valves with three flaps. Okay, and you can actually see the flaps here. Okay, it's not really that clear, but when you have the chance to do a real dissection of a heart, then inshallah you can see how they are organized in detail. Okay, and if you notice, all of these flaps are connected to the wall of the ventricle by tendons, right? And these tendons are known as cordae tendinae. And the function of this tendon is to hold the flaps at its place. Because if you don't have these tendons, okay, the high pressure produced by the ventricles might cause the flaps to be turned inside out. Okay, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, so that's the atrioventricular valve. And then we also have at the base of the pulmonary artery and the aorta, okay, another two valve that is known as the semilunar valve. Because if you look at the valve from anterior, okay, it looks like a half moon. Right? And the function of semilunar valve, okay, whenever you have blood flowing back, you can see that the pressure of the blood that moves back to the valve will cause the valve to shut, and this prevents blood from moving back into the ventricle. Okay. Okay, so next we have figure 8.28, which is a graph that shows pressure changes in the left side of the heart during the cardiac cycle. And I would like you guys to try your best to really understand what each lines in the graph mean, because questions related to this graph has came up in the past years so many times, right? So if you look at the graph, you will see that you have two different axes here. Okay, y-axis represents pressure in the heart, okay, and the unit is in kilopascal, and the x-axis represents time of the cardiac cycle. Okay, so we have already discussed and we have already learned that the cardiac cycle starts off with the atrial system. So the atria will contract first, right, before the ventricle. So if you look at the diagram, okay, this correlates perfectly, right? The pressure difference correlate perfectly with what we have learned, right? So for the first 0.1 second, the black line shows an increase in pressure, and the black line represent the atrial pressure, right? So for about 0.1 second, you can see that there is a slight increase in pressure in the atria. Okay, and right after 0.1 second, okay, and from what we have learned, right after the atrial systole, ventricle will start to contract, right? The heart will go into the ventricular systole stage, and red line represents the left ventricular pressure. That's why after 0.1 second, you can see a huge jump, okay, in terms of pressure in the left ventricle. Okay, and the difference in terms of pressure is because ventricle has much thicker wall compared to atria. So ventricle will always produce a higher pressure, okay, compared to the atria. Okay. Okay, so the blue line therefore represents the pressure changes in the aorta, right? So as the pressure builds up in the ventricle due to the ventricular systole, blood will be pushed up into the aorta, and at this particular point, okay, this is when the semilunar valve opens. This is the point where semilunar valve open, and blood from the ventricle then flows into the aorta. So that's why the blue line and the red line, it shares the same value, because the pressure comes directly from the contraction of the left ventricle. Okay, so after about 0.3 seconds, you can see that pressure starts to drop. This is when the heart moves into the ventricular diastole. Okay? This is when the heart moves into the ventricular diastole stage. So ventricle and atria starts to relax, and no more pressure is being exerted by the walls of ventricle and also the walls of the atrium. And slowly, pressure within both ventricle and atrium will slowly drop. Okay, and you can see it clearly here. So ventricular diastole will take up the remaining time in the cardiac cycle, right? So the whole thing, from the start of the atrial contraction or the atrial systole right up to the very end of the ventricular diastole, the whole event will last about 0.7 seconds. So right after that 0.7 second, a new cardiac cycle will start. Okay, and the whole sequence of event will be repeated. Okay, next we are going to look at the control of the heartbeat, how the heartbeat is actually being regulated. So basically, one of the unique feature of the heart is that it is known as a myogenic muscle. What is a myogenic muscle? Myogenic muscle is a muscle that can contract and relax on its own. So it does not really require any uh, impulse from the control center or the brain, right? So it can contract and relax naturally. Even though the heart muscle can contract on its own, it still, I mean, they are still need to be regulated, right? Because we want the heart to contract and relax in a correct sequence, which is, the atria first before the ventricle. So the contraction of the heart muscle still needs to be regulated. Okay, and this is done by two unique and specialized tissue that is located on the wall of the atria and on the wall of the ventricle, right? So the first tissue is known as the SAN, or the sinoatrial node. Okay? So sinoatrial node is also known as the pacemaker. Okay, because the sinoatrial node is the one that will set the rhythm for all other cardiac muscle. So the cardiac cycle starts off with the contraction of the SAN. Whenever SAN contract, okay, what happens is that it will send out a wave of electrical impulse, and this wave of electrical impulse will spread throughout the atria. Okay, and the nature of the muscle is that whenever it receives any electrical impulse, it will start to contract, right? So that's why whenever SAN produce this impulse, and those impulse will spread throughout the atria, both of the atria will contract simultaneously. Okay, next, the excitation wave will then move to another patch of cells, okay, another patch of specialized cells known as the AVN, or the atrioventricular node. Okay, so the initial impulse that is created by SAN, okay, can only move towards the ventricle through the AVN. There is no other way to do that, right? The only path to move to the ventricle is through the AVN. So what happens is, once the initial impulse from the atria reaches the AVN will delay the impulse for a fraction of a second before allowing the impulse to travel towards the ventricle. Okay? So the delay is to ensure that the atria will contract first before the ventricle, right? Because ventricle and atria cannot contract simultaneously because the blood is not going to go anywhere, right? So the delay is to ensure that the atria contract first before the ventricle. Okay, so once the AVN has delayed the impulse, okay, for a while, the impulse will then be allowed to move towards the apex of the heart, or towards the base of the heart, okay, through a specialized fibers known as the Purkinje fibers. Okay, and this is also important because uh, allowing the impulse to travel to the bottom of the ventricle first before they move upwards, it will allow the ventricle to contract bottom up, right? Because this is the only way that the blood can be forced or can be pushed towards the pulmonary artery and the aorta, right? So the impulse will travel downwards, okay, before it moves sideways to the wall of the left and right ventricle. Okay, and again, I would like to stress this is to ensure that the contraction of the ventricle will occur from bottom up. Okay, and finally, the ventricle will relax. Okay, the ventricle walls will relax for about 0.3 to 0.4 seconds, okay, before the start of the next cardiac cycle, which is also initiated by the contraction of SAN, which will produce a new set of impulse for the next cardiac cycle. So these are some points that I have discussed earlier. Okay, so a few of the other slides after this, okay, will also be the one that we have discussed about the control of the heartbeat. Okay, I would like to show you guys two different medical condition in which the heart loses its ability to control the heartbeat, right? So the SAN and the AVN becomes haywire. So there is no specific rhythm to control the contraction of the atria and also the ventricles. So the two conditions are the heart fibrillation and the fluttering of the heart.
If you have an abnormal heart rhythm, your doctor may perform electrical cardioversion, where he or she uses an electrical shock to restore your normal heartbeat. The heart normally beats in a regular rhythm at 60 to 100 beats per minute. This steady and coordinated rhythm allows the heart to effectively pump blood. Electrical signals that travel through the heart control the heart's rhythm. These electrical signals start in a cluster of cells called the sinoatrial node, or pacemaker. The sinoatrial node, or SA node, is located in the wall of the right upper chamber of the heart, called the right atrium. When the electrical signals reach the heart muscle, they cause it to contract and pump blood. An abnormal heart rhythm is called an arrhythmia. During atrial fibrillation, the atria quiver because of chaotic electrical signals in the heart, resulting in an abnormally fast or irregular heartbeat. Because of the abnormal heartbeat, blood may pool in the atria, which can result in the formation of a blood clot. If the blood clot passes into the general circulation, it may cause a stroke. Before the procedure, you will be connected to an intravenous line. You will be sedated so you will sleep through the procedure. EKG electrodes will be placed on your chest to monitor your heart's electrical activity. Once you are sedated, special cardioversion pads or paddles will be placed on the skin of your chest or your chest and back. These pads or paddles will deliver electrical shock through your chest to your heart. The shock may be repeated several times until the heart resumes its normal rhythm. After your electrical cardioversion, you will be monitored closely in a recovery room or in the coronary care unit of the hospital. Once the sedation wears off and you are in stable condition, you will be sent home.
Now Praveen also has left.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So
Lot of
Praveen,
oil is there.
initially used to do all everything on pump. Now after to Amrita, everything is
Off pump, that's what I heard.
100% off. 100% off cam. Everything is off cam now. So suddenly how you changing it? No, there's no need.
Vending me, that's right.
Atrás பண்ணாம தான்
So the last part of the chapter is on electrocardiogram or ECG, and ECG is basically a chart that shows the wave of excitation or the voltage value that sweeps across the heart muscles during the cardiac cycle. Okay, so not much is actually discussed in your syllabus on ECG, but you should be able to describe the different region that you have on the chart. Right, for example, the small peak that you have here, labeled as P, is basically the voltage value during the atrial contraction. Okay, QRS definitely the voltage value during ventricular contraction, while T, okay, is the voltage value during the recovery stage or during the diastolic stage of the ventricle, okay, when the heart relaxes. Okay. And basically, the physicians will use information on electrocardiogram or ECG to indicate whether a person or an individual is having any sort of heart condition, right? Because any irregular value of P, R, and T, okay, will just tell you that, right? So a person might suffer from, stroke, heart condition, okay, angina, and all of those medical conditions can actually be, can actually be shown by the ECG. Okay, so I guess that sums up everything that you guys need to know about transport in mammals. And as usual, I will leave you guys with some exercises in the Google Classroom. Okay, and inshallah, the next class, okay, we are going to proceed with the next chapter, which is gas exchange and smoking. Okay, it's a very short chapter. Okay, chapter 9 is a very short chapter. I think 1 or 2 sessions, okay, we will be able to finish up chapter 9. Okay, so I'll see you again in the next session. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.